Welcome to the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery programming series for our current show, On the Grid, curated by Kelly Dietrich. Today, we are thrilled to present the artist, Lindsay Martin Gryskewich. As a brief reminder, everyone tuning in today is in listen-only mode, so feel free to utilize that chat function and ask your questions. We'll be sure to get to them at the end of the talk. Also, please keep in mind that because we're presenting from separate locations, there might be some variation of bandwidth, so if one of us freezes up or the sound fluctuates, thanks in advance for bearing with us. All right, thanks everyone, and welcome, Lindsay.
Thank you very much, Kat, and the Rife Gallery for hosting this, and the On the Grid exhibition as well. And thank you for coming to my talk today. It's been such a nice way to take a trip down memory lane and provide this kind of chronologic evolution of things. I love the On the Grid show. I think it's a wonderful way to show vibrant work that's both colorful, full of pattern, and material studies. And I think that Kelly's done a wonderful job through Tropus projects and now on her own accord of showing regional artists and really inspiring me to seek art within kind of a local framework of near Kent, Ohio. So thank you. Yes, I'll get started. Kind of just in a snapshot of what my work is about. This is a 2024 painting that I recently finished. And my work is a collection of ephemera from memories of place, viewed through the personal lens of painting. And I'm going to kind of rehash what all of this means throughout the talk, but I restate familiarity through translations of the image in hope to create what was once tangible, but also to identify new experiences in painting. In the works, the ambiguity of space, but the specificity of place really intrigues me. And I question differences and similarities of reconstructed memories throughout the painting process. I am very curious in painting to compare interior and exterior imagery, so you'll see a lot of that. The symbolism of architecture, but also the psychological perspective of interior design. And these challenges are met with the language and the long history of painting, its associations, but also expansion through new materials that I find. I think that paintings are poetic anecdotes, and one can insert oneself into an alternative place when looking at paintings. A painting is almost an escape window, a doorway to the past, and a barrier between interior and exterior. And I think for me, this began throughout my childhood with moving a lot. I grew up in the suburban Midwest region, and between when I was born and reaching adulthood at the age of 18 and leaving for college, my family and I moved about 10 different times. So every couple years I was packing, my family was packing, unpacking, resettling into a new experience. And then my mother would kind of make this home space comfortable through colors and new decorations and reinventing the interior spaces. And then we would have memories and kind of experiences, short-lived, and then we would pack up and depart again. My grandfather was into real estate, and so he bought and sold homes quite often, and so we would just pack up. Didn't have too much control over it, but we lived everywhere from bland townhouses to apartments to very dated decades condos to new builds that are now very kind of identify as that 90s traditional architecture. So I think about those kind of dated versions of the past in each home, and they kind of present themselves with this little capsule of time in itself. These are some Zillow ad images that I took of some of the homes we lived in around Akron. And surprising enough, they're still very dated to that time period. that we arrived in. So it was an interesting place to see, interesting thing to see. My parents in themselves are artists, and were artists. My mom pocketed kind of her artwork and still does today in stolen moments. But I think that it was a really good way for me to see how one has to continually make art or to do a passion of theirs, even though she was a single mother. And so it was hard for her to have time and to play around, but she constantly made when we weren't um, present and in those stolen midnight moments. So it was a way of her reaching out and not being mother or a daughter, but rather a maker. And my father was a creative spirit who had a very artistic soul. He shortly after I was born, he moved out to Oregon, and he died a few years later. And so I didn't really know him, but I got to know my father and have a relationship with him through his writings, his journaling, his objects that he kept. And then as an adolescent, my family would kind of give me boxes of his little trinkets and objects of memorabilia. And I think that those kind of latched onto this person and this kind of relationship that I was having with him. So through objects, I was able to create memories of him, even though I didn't really know him. And I think about that, and then even in this slide, this is my grandmother's cottage that she had for 40 years. And it looked the same for 40 years in every picture. And I think about that cottage that she had and my grandmother, and it's almost like place and the memory of her are intertwined. And these objects that are inside the space are also present, and they're kind of like keys to this memory. Much like these Adirondack chairs of my maternal great-grandmothers. I still have them and can't help but to think of my great-grandmother whenever I'm sitting in one. Not Adirondack, lawn chairs. And I think about memory as this kind of growing evolutionary piece, and how memory can grow as you restate it, as you reconnect with it. That memory is this living thing, and it's kind of pliable. Anecdote that I'm thinking about today is how my grandmother thought she was a gypsy because a fortune teller told her in the 60s. And so she kept telling us when we were kids. And then as a young adult, I would say, oh, my background is I was a Eastern European gypsy. And then my family was like, no, I don't think we were, but it was that memory constantly being repeated and reflected in a new way. And then all of a sudden it had this new truth about it. So I think about that a lot with working with my places in the painting. I grew up in Akron, Ohio, where there are, much like a lot of Midwest towns, there's these dated pieces of architecture that are sitting next to each other, where you can have an 1800s cottage in the country right next to a very new contemporary modern build. And so you see 20s a lot. You see times where we've had prosperity, and then kind of times where Akron's hasn't prospered. And so I think architecture is within us all, as well as a lot of salvaged items, especially around Akron. I think we have wealth in a lot of antique. So I think growing up in Akron has really formed also my love of place and interior spaces. These photographs are my twin aunts, and I didn't know much about art kind of coming into college, other than what was very traditional, kind of beginner. I knew I like to draw and paint, and I did that in my free time, but knew nothing about contemporary art or art history. But when I looked at these photographs of my aunts in the 80s, I thought, wow, what a way to be sophisticated and kind of utilize photography as this place, body, kind of, working with place experience and kind of working with architecture. And I loved these photographs so much, but I thought that it also held stories of my aunts that I could use for creative inspiration. And so I took photographs of my family with me to college, not knowing what I was going to do with them, but I thought, here's a place that I could possibly enter and step into as I think about kind of what my meaning is behind making. I went to Denison University. This is one lone photograph I found of our studio space in the senior halls in Bryan Art Center. And I started off as a creative writing major, very naively. My parents didn't go to college, so was kind of alone in the route to take and what the long-term agenda was. But I knew I loved to read and write, so I started with a creative writing major. And I started writing about things that I would make as paintings later in my painting classes. And so I ended up getting a dual major in both studio art and creative writing. And my collection of kind of stories and prose were of my family and of kind of their past experiences and me finding these past experiences either through stories or through objects. And so you see on the left is one of the paintings. I was very new in everything from color theory to composition, wasn't sure what I was doing, and I was following this very weird material process that I started doing. And I photographed one of these boxes of my father's, and it had a bunch of objects in it, and one of them had a business card from Oregon, and it was his business as a handyman service was called Venture Contractors. And when you think of venture, it means to kind of daringly, boldly go into an adventure or a journey, a brave journey pursuit. And then contractors means kind of to build, to fix, to make. And so I thought those two words together were really interesting and spurred kind of a long-term investigation of what that means to be a venture contractor. This photograph paired with fragments of paint and paper started looking very physical, like kind of a terrain map, almost geologic. And I started making these scraps put together compositions in my senior year. Very new on how a painting could be successful, but I did like the fact that found materials were lending itself to paint. So you have a map of Akron here, you have interior fabric, and then you've got these colors that reminded me of Midwest November landscapes and kind of like a lot of browns and that sort of thing. And I noticed that I'm also making a lot that are like 8.5 by 11 or 9 by 12 and 12 or vertical spaces that also remind me of the 8.5 by 11 paper that you would have for a story. And so here's a photograph of my grandmother's Afghan paired with this collage of journal and fabric from an interior space and kind of bits and pieces, and everything kind of starting to feel like it belongs in a landscape, but it's not a landscape. There's no perspective, there's no space, but there's color and kind of this geologic thing being invoked. I left with a bunch of pieces, graduated, wasn't sure where this was going, but I went back home pretty much and lived in my uncle's above garage apartment in rural Ohio. And this property was a historic home in itself. It was built in the 1930s in the Art Deco period, and my uncle was a historian. So not only was the house itself a historical object of significance, but inside the house were all these objects that he's collected over the years, everywhere from Native American arrowheads to bowler hats from famous people to just pieces and parts that he's an antique collector. And seeing him use his entire life was really devoted to this house. The upkeep was constant. It was a Mount Sisyphus project, but I got to kind of get to know him more as I lived there and walk through this property that he lovingly created. It was his art project, and very inspiring. I wasn't making that much. I was doing sketches and drawings, and I did mainly the drawings that I did do were of this space. And simultaneously, I was also working full-time in arts administration for Stan Hewitt Hall in historical. It was a historical home. It was built in 1915. And so you'd walk through the halls and you would see this amazing craftsmanship, never to be seen again, as well as these objects that some are so antiquated. They come from pre-Renaissance era that the family had shipped from England. So you saw this historical value and stories in each object. And then you also got to know the family through stories. So the historian side of this time period between my undergrad and grad school was very interesting for me. And but I knew I wanted to concentrate on something. And I really believed that I wanted to continue painting pursuits. So I left my roots and I decided to choose a program, one very far away in Portland, Oregon, the Oregon College of Art and Craft. Two, it was a small, intimate campus, but it seemed really active and exciting. There just seemed like there were a lot of things going on, and making was very all the projects that were seeing coming out of it were just blowing my mind. And I also loved their studio approach. So I bought this camper for $1,500 and had never left Canton, Ohio before, but we took it across country and we stayed in it. My now husband, then boyfriend at the time, we stayed in it until I could find a place to live as I got my grad degree. And seeing that landscape and being inside the camper was a great experience for me to begin collecting and sifting through material to begin making. And I started with these very off-colored small flash on paper paintings of the interior space of the camper. And then when I got to my studio and finally had time, but no money, I was very broke when I got to to OCAC. So I started working with salvaged materials, lots of thrifted Goodwill canvases. And I was just trying to make things big, even though I've been working small for several years. And bits and pieces of discarded items and kind of things that fascinated me in the thrift store were coming into my painting. So I was making a lot of weird stuff. It kind of looked abstract. I think I was pushing myself to experiment with abstraction, color theory. But also they still have that physicality that like landscape terrain that the undergrad work featured. But something that I really liked that came out of this, I have no idea what I'm doing phase, were these material studies sculptural paintings. I had these leftover remnants from a friend who was redoing an old kitchen, and these dated cedar planks and these cabinets, and I was taking things apart and then dumping paint and plaster on top of them. And I was going to cover them, but realized that the historic value of them and the kind of history and memory embedded with the object, that it could be used from the kitchen drawer was kind of interesting in itself. So I'm trying to make work that responses to that historical wood piece. And I'm thinking of found fabrics. I'm thinking of the pattern on the fabrics. I'm thinking of pattern I can make. I'm thinking of landscape as well, but it's still coming out as these kind of natural looking layers of sediment. So these are the beginnings of what I think is becoming very experimental. I'm also thinking of kind of almost like pockets of place or metamorphic kind of paintings where things are conglomerated onto one another. This is an installation project I did very early on with wallpaper, and you have this little kind of pocket piece that non-rectilinear, but I'm trying all these new things. And I went from trying everything from kind of a sculptural pursuit to making these little dioramas out of paint and fabric and paper and foam, and then I would photograph them. Then I would do this process of painting the photographs, painting from the photographs, and making these collages, trying to figure out what the end result was. And there's bits and pieces of landscape pattern going on, but it still feels very interior because the colors are very insane. They're very dated. I still was holding on to remnants of I think the dated decades interiors. So a lot of 70s orange was coming around. And I was trying to see how the painted pattern of that I was finding in landscape and in nature and the found fabrics were working together. Was it evoking a landscape? Was it evoking more or less kind of just an abstracted composition? So after a year of trial and error and experimentation, I went back to rectilinear work, and these are my first kind of successes at just paint and paint on panel, oil paint. And here is also where I see organization happening, and I see space coming into the work in some respect. So an actual landscape. However, does it feel like a landscape because of the pattern? So there's still that push and pull. Is it supposed to be interior, or is it supposed to be this landscape that we're looking onwards in? But I do like the fact this was kind of taken from an experience I had battling a snowstorm in Montana and driving through it because I'm had no idea what was in Montana in January. Thankfully, people helped us. But so I was thinking about that experience and just trying to recreate what it felt like to be in the snowstorm through pattern and two different kind of color experimentations. And while I'm starting to do more traditional painting on panel, I'm doing a lot of research. And Giorgio de Chirico had often come up in my undergrad work and I was revisiting his work, especially his interior studies, the metaphysical interiors, where he's collaging bits and pieces of objects into a room together, and you feel like you can wander through the room. It's like a dream, but it's also different furniture and different objects, and they're all kind of invested into one another and relating to one another. But you can see this escape window that he's built for you. And I'm reading a lot about Gaston Bachelard and Poetics of Space at the time, and the philosopher had a great way of going into interior studies and studying rooms and corners and window ledges, but then taking the reader out to the exterior and navigating both polar opposites of space, and how in a forest, in that immense vastness, you feel smaller than sometimes when you ruminate indoors inside. And I was most struck by this idea of what happens in the barrier, in the divide between interior and exterior. And he called it, he was describing a door, which he would bring up poet painters or painters as people who are trying to open this door or provide this experience. And he would sift it. And also, I think the geometric place of comings and goings was something that I really thought about a lot. And in my research too, I was looking at, and still do today, I think that this research is all valid for what I continually am making, but Marsden Hartley, very expressive landscape artists, the Canadian group, where you know that this is an exact place situated, and I'm talking about the painting on the left, but you don't know, you know that there's a break between him seeing the space and him painting it, through how moody and expressive it feels. Likewise, Milton Avery's Parade of Trees is a great example of Avery's work for how his color is spot on and yet off in some way. It's really expressive, and the landscapes are simplistic, but it feels like I'm there and I know what I'm looking at. But there's this divide that's non-observational. And then I was also looking at a lot of interior painters. So the history of painting kind of just coming through, a lot of Western painting as well. And Pierre Bernard, the kind of post-impressionist group of the Nabi painters, were very obsessed with memory in a sense. And so their work, there's this kind of romanticized versions of the real interior space. And that's that painting on the left, the open window. And he did a lot of those barriers in his work, the window, the doorway to another room, the doorway out to the garden that I loved. And then on the right, you see David Hockney, who's a little bit more contemporary, and he is working with interior, but he's also playing around with space in a very, very interesting way, where you see 3 different rooms of a home in Man Bathing in Beverly Hills, but they're all combined together, and your eye through color just flits around. And so I'm really researching these paintings in depth.
Lindsay,
David Hockney's lecture on space in itself
hey,
really
Lindsay.
presented. Yes.
Lindsay, I just wanted to let you know that we're seeing the images as you're seeing them. So if
Okay.
they're on the left-hand side for you, they're on the left-hand side for us. So
Okay.
just for those that are viewing or anyone that's listening, making it a little easier for them.
Oh, great. Okay. Perfect. And sometimes I really doubt left hand and right hand, and often we'll go like, okay, so I think I did the opposite. You're right. So sorry about that. If you have any questions, I'd be happy to resend those. Okay, wonderful. So, so David Hockney's lecture on the right, the medieval painting, he talks a lot about how, or no, it's the left. Sorry. So on the left, you see the pre-medieval painting, and how space isn't really presented in a way that the Renaissance kind of did. First and second point perspective, it's actually kind of making us slip and fall out of the painting. And he, in his lecture, says that this space is okay, and rather it allows us to question it and to follow kind of this meandering of sorts in a way that we're thinking about space. And even though we're slipping off of the painting, this is all right. And that no space in the painting is correct, but rather things to be experimented with. Japanese style vertical landscapes as well. It makes our eye go instead of from right to left, like a lot of Western painting, such as his large expansive Grand Canyon at the bottom. But the Japanese style landscape kind of lends us to also think of space in a different way, of verticality. So I was thinking a lot about that. when creating master bedroom so this one is an on the grid show, and I've really thought I've hit a very successful note of taking this experience I had with my step grandmother in her home in the 90s, adding her glamorous bits in her favorite part of the house, and then kind of mixing it up using the rectilinear space as this kind of groundwork for how I was going to arrange this puzzle of space. And then kind of having fun with it and being playful. The grid of tile that is inherent in all the gaudy 90s tile, but the carpeted bathroom and things I'm thinking about kind of flitting from that time period, but using my own color composition. And as I wander through the space, I'm lent an escape window in the back, which is the pool. And similarly, that painting has a partner in itself, my grandfather's painting. So I was thinking of his favorite space in his home. And he wakes early for the qualifying after his Formula One fandom. There's a lot of pieces and parts of here that have truths to them, but then I'm again using the rectilinear space to just kind of condense his favorite parts of his property and kind of push them in, and then navigating some objects that I think are clues and identifiers, such as the tires in the foreground that kind of lend themselves to the rubber city that is Akron and his love of Akron, and then his pretend Ferrari that it was never there, but we always have talked about it. So that it belongs there. And I started doing this kind of condensing and folding of experience in these vertical landscapes with my thesis work from grad school. This one is kind of a weekend or road trip in Eugene, where you see the Douglas firs in the background. And so I'm mashing kind of the road trip you would take through the farmland that's around I-5 in Eugene to the mountain range, and then through to the beach. So kind of trying to condense space through these works. Similarly, this kind of autumnal collegiate painting, I think that material is finally finding itself back in a successful way with the pleather road. So I really like this painting because the material is finally inserted in a meaningful way of breaking up the barrier and becoming the image itself. Here I'm taking 3 different ideas of architecture and putting them into one painting. So it kind of feels very segmented. There's a lot that doesn't work for me in this painting anymore, but there's a lot of territory of movement. And I use this painting, I think, to further along how space could be conveyed. So there's a 90s kitchen from one of our homes that we lived in, paired with a Californian patio in West Coast, paired with this classical architecture. And then me finding pattern that I'm making myself in trying to keep some hold of an abstraction going on. And I'm still playing around a lot with color. After grad school, I did a couple experiences with my cohort where we would take writing and pair it with painting. I think in my thesis show, we took soap and scents and paired it with painting to provide another kind of reflection on how experience could be lived. It could be visual, such as a painting, but it could also be through writing, through scent, through smell. And so I had a lot of grad students who were working with memory also kind of add their take. And so I think really liked the oppositional poem and then painting because it provided this different way of reflecting. But I think after grad school, I really needed a break. And I was provided a residency at Subtle Lodge in Deschutes National Forest, where it was January, there was a snowstorm. It felt like The Shining because it was just me and this caretaker on this very large property in the middle of nowhere. Um, but it was a really rich place for thinking about interior decoration and space through all these cabins that were lovingly preserved, this big lodge. And so I made these small cabin paintings. And here I'm kind of flipping a little bit of the memory in itself. So I'm not taking it so far back, and I'm not working with a person or an experience, but rather my experiences that I'm having in this space. The memory is still present, but it's very short. I'm still walking through the same pace, the same places, and the similar situations. So I thought that was really beneficial. And it's also my first work with just acrylic on panel. So I'm really testing it out and trying to find a successful way of not needing the beauty of oil because I'm working in a tiny cabin. Um, so then after a few months, we took a temporary trip back to Ohio, got married. One of us got a job, was going to be temporary, and then COVID happened, and we bought this house. And it was a very bland house built in 1960 that was not really looked at since the 60s. It was very simplistic too. It was almost like this blank slate. And it became my COVID project. I had a lot of things, from the cross country moved, the new position to the wedding and everything, a lot of life things going on. And so it was hard to make after my residencies. And so this house, in its sense, was an art project in a creative space. So we're putting up wallpaper, we're making things our own, we're fixing a lot of things, we're learning how to build in different ways. And I think it's becoming an inspirational resource. I set up a home studio in this house and started making small acrylic-based work. And here I've got 3 seasons, so I'm thinking of seasonal changes, slightly inflecting fear of an old house and the water that comes with winter and spring in Ohio. And so I'm thinking about a 3-season porch and that lovely divide that you have in an interior and exterior space in this porch setting. And again, using the rectilinear space, this is a very square home, and trying to collapse it and condense it into something that is more different and unique. Coyote Neighbor Night was this experience of finding coyotes in our backyard, paired with this kind of route that you would take through bedroom to bathroom. And so you see kind of this meandering into the home, but some remnants, and I'm putting some found materials and then painting on top of them. So the green pieces have fabric underneath them. There's string with the name of the person who lived here, the initials, because they were found inside the closet space of this bedroom. So I'm thinking a little bit about past and present and kind of the mystery of all of it. The previous owners, they cut these trees in half, about 5 feet tall. The trees kept growing and kept kind of being part of the conversation with the other trees in the backyard. And so I paired that with kind of more of a color study. And these are very small paintings, but they're really great beginnings to what is now larger work. This conversation set is it's just thinking about how these trees spark conversation in a reality, but also the space and what it could be in the backyard. And thinking also a lot about what they did after the Colert family lived here for 60 years. so different from my own upbringing, that they just lived in this house and were settled with it and kind of made do, and a lot of fix-it projects. Some things were very functional that we've kept, such as this really ugly rope attached to our house, to this young maple tree in the backyard. It's so functional, and it deserves its own kind of praise. So I built a painting space around this yellow rope, and working with the present, working with kind of this place over and over again, but I'm also moving it in a way that I'm finding it more interesting and more unique. I think that the current home does not look like this at all, but how to kind of imagine oneself in some kind of romantic fashion. And this also, in the show, Night Kitchenette, or titled something similar, is one of those half-truths where I'm imagining this certain wallpaper being reflected, and I'm imagining this kind of neat, clean lines of the tile, but it isn't, I'm finding this similar portrayal of the kitchenette that we have, but invoking kind of different objects in it and playing with some new things, where I'm building my own interior space through my paintings. In 2022, yes, I did a short, I would say it was a workshop residency experience at Kent Blossom, where I got to kind of have my own studio there. It's a really wonderful program for, I think, both undergrads, grad students, but also emerging artists. So definitely check it out. But I was able to get away from being a new mother in my house, which did not lend itself creatively for a while, and make these smaller pieces. And I'm adding acrylic caulk to my work. And I'm also adding objects that reference this child in a way, or this experience. So these objects become, even though it's not a portrait of my son, it's an object that holds the same feeling in a way. A little bit about my process is I find things right now, and I think especially in the landscape, as I want to kind of create it to a more unique appeal, is that I find things that are interesting. I take photos, and then I sketch thumbnails, or short little thumbnails, and these thumbnails don't have any color associated with them. And I take it back to the studio, and then I can insert myself kind of with new color in them. So really the thumbnail images are what I work from. It might be that the color itself kind of reflects back into the memory so vividly, but these two willows killing the young arborvitaes, and the failure at landscaping in this backyard of my friends nearby was really interesting for me. And I thought that the way that they were kind of leaning to one side and crowding out the poor dead young trees, I thought that was really interesting. So these kind of spaces are rich territory. And similarly, I work with kind of experiences that I have, not just in my own home, but in homes that I have familiarity with, and lived experiences, taking photographs, and then coming back to them later and kind of inventing them on the canvas, half-truths in a way, of these experiences. And then also, I think recently in my work, this is a smaller piece, the objects themselves are starting to lend more foreground than the kind of geometric abstraction of space. So I find that a rich territory. Lately, too, in my work, there's this kind of moment that I think of the painting as an escape window. So I'm thinking kind of in this tendency to put reality in one bracket of space in the work, and this fantasized landscape in the other, and how that's starting to speak more to a conversation as I am a new mom. So Spring Break Sprites is kind of this idyllic spring break in the background, with the reality in the foreground and showing kind of a story and a narrative and memory through objects more so than the spaces. So I'm working a lot more trying to also incorporate more 3D elements in the newest work. And I'm excited where this kind of has in this moment of telling a story and kind of being a little bit about motherhood and being part of it's somebody else's space. It's not just my own, and not making it this idyllic space as landscapes tend to lend themselves, but a space that I can situate myself in. Similar entryways, which is in the On the Grid show, is much like that experience where you have landscape around the edges, and then you have this interior space. You're kind of looking between one or the other in these doorways. Thinking of our current doorway, and then there's a house that we were interested in that had this herringbone yellow tile. And thinking about that doorway too as the realm of possibilities, incorporating my son with a soccer ball, but then also Georgia O'Keeffe's Padernal Mountain in the background. I think about Georgia O'Keeffe's lifestyle as this romantic artist on Ghost Ranch in New Mexico, painting every day and returning to this Padernal Mountain as kind of a goal in the back of, I think, every person or mother's mind who has that passion and knows that someday in the distance there will be that Padernal Mountain experience, but right now it's kind of covered and immersed and enmeshed with several other places and spaces. So I think that's where my work is currently at. Alongside working, I'm a teacher, and I make sure that my students are able to experience off-site pursuits and to get to delve into the outside world and through landscape painting. So I think that's very important for me, and it's been very prolific. It's made me think of a lot of materials in very new ways because they are so resourceful. And this summer as well, I joined Threshold Collective, which has been really inspiring. It's a group of artists whose work is in connection to memory in the domestic realm. And so you see how other people are kind of utilizing the same themes and discussing it. These artists are from all over the nation, so it's really nice to kind of come together on our monthly Zoom meetings and really talk about work, talk about everything around the work. And we are having an invitational show, Living Space at Wavelength Space in Chattanooga, Tennessee, opening October. So if you're interested in kind of memory and place, definitely look at the work in that show. As well as the upcoming show I have at Summit Art Space. So it'll be opening October 4th, just as On the Grid closes, so you can get place and space somewhere else. So lots of work, and I'm just really happy to share it with other people who are navigating similar passions. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lindsay. Folks, if you have any questions, please drop them into the comments. And we do have a question. You talk a lot about the different styles of homes and the interior design trends of the decades. What is your favorite style and why?
I think this is great. My favorite style, I think, is I definitely, and my mother was never, she hated this style, so this is probably why I like it. But it is the kind of, and she grew up with this, so it's not the tired. She grew up with a more of the mid-century kind of clean lines, clean space, but very bold colors. I think of Werner Pantone, the designer, the furniture designer, and his work with architecture and interior space a lot as rich territory for a painter to get into. But I saw a lot of our homes being turned from mid-century to traditional 90s. And I think there somewhere along was me just trying to pull it back. And so my home is from the mid-century as well. And so trying to give it back its own decade has been a work in progress. And and you can see some of that in some of the paintings, but it's also in Oregon, I think it's more prevalent in their interior design versus in Ohio. So I wonder if maybe living here I'm missing that, or I started getting really used to that mid-century architecture, and it's very trendy right now. So but I like kind of also haphazard and interesting interior spaces where you're like, who saved this? How ugly can it be? To somebody, it was this very beautiful thing. I think pink tile is in a couple of my pieces, and people either love it or they hate it. So it's a nice conversation.
Wonderful. We have another question, this one from Ellen. Are there any new places you would like to travel for more interior and exterior inspiration?
Oh, well, I'll come to you, Ellen, and Greece. Um, no, I think that I'm really excited. I'd like to, we were just in Costa Rica and I found some of the spaces to be really exciting. They kind of are their own makers of a lot of the architecture is made by hand in a lot of more kind of the local Costa Rican residences, but they're also very colorful and bold, and they're not afraid to kind of just there's this they don't mow the grass, and they just kind of enjoy this free flowing about it. And I really started being coming interested in that. But I think right now the blank slate of the Midwest has been very beneficial in its sense. I feel like a painting is needed. So when you tend to go elsewhere, there's this, it's already so beautiful. Why touch it? Why kind of mess with the space and place? But I'm looking to do more of the subtle residency experiences where I can immerse myself in one place and draw upon that experience to make work. But I think you have to spend time in a space. So I think that's a really good territory I'd like to continue working on, as I think I'm really excited about my work with my own home. This painting right here being from my backyard, but I think I'm also seeing some new work venturing out elsewhere. So I think I'm ready to get out of the house in a way that's rich ground.
So, Lindsay, I see some really phenomenal connections, particularly to your material studies early work, even in this work, and how you represent color. There's some modulation, but you use a lot of really chromatic blocks of color where you can see a little bit underneath. So there's a history there. Can you talk a little bit about how you create the lines of your work? You are definitely guiding a viewer through this particular work, right? And how you've kind of collaged together different bits of memory and landscape. Chat with us a bit about that process and how you've come to that.
Right. I think that a little bit of it has to do with the box is drawn first in my current work. I think that the early work with the found material was great because I was trying to push myself to not use that parameter. But it is the thing that I see as most. It is the way that I think photos start lending itself when I take a photo of a interesting thing in the landscape, and then the box is created. And then when I do my thumbnail sketches, I think I draw the box first. So there's that. And then there's this sense of where the space begins and where it ends that comes after. So a lot of times you see, and I think back to kind of the Japanese style of how they do the foreground and then you're kind of wandering upward. But I do try to invoke other ways of walking around a painting, whether it's I'm paying attention to the sides and or I'm breaking it up through kind of a series of triangles. But I am looking at kind of how a lot of abstract painters navigate their very minimal work and how they use the grid. So when Kelly's show title kind of appeared, I thought, yes, that's definitely what I think of, especially Frank Stella and his work, how his work is always harkening back to the grid method, but you know, you're finding small spaces and then you're finding very large spaces even in his patterns in some of his work, not the very minimal stuff, but yes, I think I'm kind of trying to see where the distance is happening and I'm playing with that landscape versus that abstraction a lot with how I'm building the painting space.
Excellent. You actually answered my second question within your answer, so that's wonderful. And I think we have time for one uh, question and comment from Samantha Bishop, who has also said some of it's already been answered. That's the nature of, typing questions. Samantha said, the perspective, dimension, paths, and portals in your paintings invite the viewer inside in an almost tangible way. Strangers can walk through your memories. Do you imagine the viewer touring these spaces when you create? And if so, does that change representation of the memory in ways beyond the navigability of the space?
So what I think, do I imagine others kind of inserting themselves? And I try to lend the, I try to lend uh kind of clues for people to enter. But there's also uh a lot of it's like working with problems too, so solving problems through spaces. Before in this particular painting right here, there was and you'll see it, there was this basement and I was kind of considering how people were going above and under, and I really thought that was rich territory. It didn't end up working for me after sitting with it for a few months, so I kind of went back in and re-navigated the space. But I do think about how the a viewer could insert themselves, and but I also know that some people find it, and I've talked to a lot of people too, because I do enjoy wandering through other people's interior paintings, and then some people don't feel that they can arrive at certain spots and they kind of hide in corners, or they'll, everybody's perspective has been very different with my work. And it's a great conversation I love to be in. And one person, I think they're like, I can't sit anywhere, even though you have chairs in a lot of your paintings, but I can be over there in that very clean, calm, green grassed landscape outside that doorway. So I think I try to kind of make multiple spots in case there's like this kind of escape route that's not working for others. I do think about, though, yeah, how one can kind of nestle themselves in, and if it's relatable to others. And I think that the drive to sample and place examples of different landscapes and architectural features hopefully kind of gain some kind of clarity with different people who identify with different interior spaces. So I know that some people won't look at these and imagine some kind of home site, but rather this weird alien world. And so how can, so I do think about the viewer. I think about a lot more of my own experience, though. So I think of Yeah, I think that whenever I have a conflicting question or problem, I'm thinking back to where I would like to sit and where I would like to resonate with. So,
Wonderful. I think that places us beautifully here at the end. Thank you again, Lindsay, for the generosity of your time and talents. Thank you all for joining us for this artist talk by Lindsay Martin Gryskewich as a part of our programming for On the Grid. A special thank you to our curator, Kelly Dietrich. A big thank you to all the participating artists, as well as the Ohio Arts Council's board, the Ohio legislature, and the governor who support the Ohio Arts Council, this great space, and of course, Ohio artists. Thanks so much, everyone, and have a great day.